Welcome back if you watched the first video, and if you're just tuning in for the first time, welcome. This is Jazz Thoughts with me, Andrew. So the last video was my first one, and I'm thrilled to say that a lot of people watched it. We're currently up to 130 views last I checked. It might even be more by now. I also got some comments about what people wanted to hear and what I could change and do differently. Also, if you ever think I'm wrong about something, please let me know, because I'd love to learn. So today we're going to continue with the Unity album and Joe's solo on his tune If. But before we do that, I kind of wanted to talk about something, and that has a lot to do with understanding and appreciating jazz. So much of jazz is about context and stories and personalities and history and dynamics and narratives. And at least one person has said, give us some background. So I'm going to try to include some of that. In that vein, I first learned about this album from a keyboard player at a jam session I went to. So jam sessions are exactly what they sound like. It's where a bunch of jazz musicians come together and play a bunch of tunes that everyone knows. They're historically super important. It's basically where bebop came from in the 40s and marked the change of jazz from basically dance music to art music that people would actually sit and listen to and enjoy. So I'm talking to this keys player, and he gives me his business card and says, before you do anything tomorrow, listen to this album. It's called Unity by Larry Young, look it up. And so the next day, what did I do? Definitely not listen to Unity. I think I forgot, but I was super into the trumpet player Woody Shaw, who plays on this album. So a few months later, I was reading about him, and I came across something about how he first came on the scene at the age of 19. And so I was, of course, thinking to myself, now I have to find this album that he played on that put him on the map. And of course, you'll never guess what album it was. It was Unity. And so I listened to it. I listened to the whole album, and it blew me away, of course. But it just goes to show, at least for me, that with any kind of art, in order to really get it, you have to have some kind of background to inform your experience. I didn't even care enough to go listen to the record until I saw that Woody Shaw was on it. And then I found out that Joe Henderson and Elvin Jones were on the album, also two of my favorites. Picking up where we left off, we were talking about the head and Joe's first chorus on If, which is the blues on this album. Blues, of course, is kind of a loose term, because it's theoretically a blues, of course. It's 12 bars long, and the underlying chord progressions, especially in the solos, suggest that it's probably a blues. But the similarities really end there. It doesn't always sound super bluesy, even though you can kind of hear some of the blues influence, especially if you're familiar with it and kind of know what you're looking for, like blue notes and blues scales. Instead, this is a sound that's called modern jazz or post-bop. It basically refers to the sound that came out of the 60s. I would call it equal parts John Coltrane and Miles Davis. Those two really cast a huge shadow over all of jazz basically after the 1960s. You can hear how John Coltrane and his pianist McCoy Tyner influenced Larry Young if you compare Unity to jazz before 1961, basically. And of course, Elvin Jones, who plays on Unity on this record, was John Coltrane's drummer and radically changed jazz drumming with his polyrhythmic technique and style. Polyrhythms are many rhythms played at the same time. So let's listen to a polyrhythm that Elvin plays in Joe's second chorus. I sort of got into this in the last video because polyrhythms are a great way of getting around or outside of typical groups of four in your phrasing and going across the bar line. These are really interesting sounds that create a really strong push and pull feeling and forward momentum. Polyrhythms are different from strictly playing different groupings of notes because it really means you're doing both at the same time. In this case, 3 note groupings and 4. So Elvin Jones in the ride cymbal, and Larry Young especially in the bass on his organ foot pedals are playing fours, sort of. But if you can pick it out, Elvin is playing that shifting push-pull feeling of polyrhythms by pairing the 4 feel with a 3-note grouping in his accents on the snare drum. If that's not enough, he's playing the 3s very differently from the way you would expect. He's setting up an expectation and then doing the unexpected. So in rhythms, in music, especially in jazz, especially in, Western music, you have beats that feel weaker and beats that feel stronger. It's kind of an up-down feeling, kind of like walking, or you could say that the weak beats are connecting the strong beats together in a time signature of 4 where you're counting to 4 for every measure. The strong beats are 1 and to a lesser extent 3, and beats 2 and 4 are weaker. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And in 3, beat 1, the first beat, is stronger, and beat 3 is a little less strong, with 2 being the weak beat. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But what happens when you intentionally emphasize or accent the weak beats? Emphasizing or accenting weak beats is something called syncopation, which sounds very unexpected and out of place, kind of like you're being jerked around, but it can also sound very artful and exciting, like when someone like Charlie Parker does it, who really mastered and popularized this technique in the 1940s. So syncopation by 1966 is already a classic sound in jazz. It really is starting to sound like the tradition of the music. So you may have guessed it, but Elvin here is playing a syncopation within his polyrhythm. And this is a prime example of post-bop, taking the jazz tradition, jazz common practice, and totally messing with it until it becomes almost unrecognizable. So what he's doing is playing in 4, but creating a 3 feel with his snare hits on the second beats of what are essentially imaginary bars of 3. So here's that. So you might notice that on the first and fourth groups of 3, he does something unexpected. He leaves out the accent, which to me is kind of a similar feeling to being on a roller coaster and, zooming down the hill. Or maybe, you're missing a step, because you're missing a beat that you thought you were going to get. And he plays this particular rhythm a lot in this tune, which Joe and Larry Young and Woody Shaw pick up on and play with in their own way. And of course, you can probably imagine that these musicians are absolutely in awe to be playing with one of their all-time musical heroes. So that's a super interesting example of Elvin Jones' influence on drumming, his use of polyrhythms, the way he changed drumming in the 1960s to incorporate historical aspects of jazz and play them in a new and very creative way. That's all I have for today. Thanks so much for watching. Bye. Thank you.